back to another video on my channel. My name is Dion and you're watching Reptiliatus. Friends, you may have just watched my last video, which I posted up on Tuesday. And in that video, I showed you guys the exciting new Exoterra line called Frogs & Co. that's specialized in bioactive Vivarium and really fills that missing niche or void when it comes to hobbyists fascinated with keeping amphibians in herpetoculture. Well, you may have also seen that I created a Drylok terrarium background to create a more dynamic and pleasurable enclosure for viewing purposes. Not only this, it provides more security for the inhabitants, and I assured you that in today's video I would be providing you with a tutorial on how to create that same type of background or effect. Now, before we get into the video, I'm gonna be doing two things. Firstly, I'd like to introduce myself again. My name is Dion. I make videos about specialty pets, such as reptiles, amphibians, and different kinds of invertebrates. So if you're interested in learning more about these animals, definitely consider subscribing down below and then dinging that little notification bell down there afterwards so that you don't miss any of my uploads, because I post videos every Tuesday and Friday. The second thing I want to do that's extremely important is to provide credit where it's due.
Welcome back to the Tropical Garage. My name's Troy.
Troy Goldberg's the man when it comes to keeping really cool dart frog species and teaching his audience how to build incredible enclosures. Troy is the go-to creator. I would say that Troy is the individual who popularized the Drylok background, and I really want to take a moment to thank him and give him due credit for this, as well as show my appreciation. I've had a few conversations with him in the past, and he's always been so helpful when it comes to questions regarding keeping dart frogs. I also want to give credit to my good buddy Mike Taitula, because funny enough, it was through his video showing Troy's method of doing the Drylok background that I came across this process in the first place. So thank you, Mike. Thank you, Troy, for showing me the Drylok method. I'm now very excited to have the opportunity to show my own audience how I went about doing this for the first time.
Alright friends, now let's go ahead and take a look and see what you'll need to create the Drylok background in your naturalistic Vivaria.
So naturally, the first thing you need is your terrarium of choice. So once you have that set up, we're gonna need a lot of animal safe spray foam. I recommend the Pond & Stone Great Stuff because it's black and obviously animal safe. And alternatively, you can use the all-purpose black foam, which also works really well. You'll likely need 2 to 3 cans to cover 3 sides of an enclosure this size. Next, we're going to need silicone. For this, it needs to be devoid of mold inhibitors, so you're looking for a clear S1 silicone. It can be brown, that might even be better, but it needs to be S1 as you saw there. Because this is a Drylok background, we're obviously going to need a gallon of Drylok. Now this will make many backgrounds, you don't need that much, but it's good to have, so buy a gallon bucket. Now we don't want our Drylok to be gray, of course, so what we use is these cement colors to add coloration to the Drylok to make it more natural. You'll need several paintbrushes to apply the Drylok to the background once it's carved. Now you could use a paint tray, but I bought this paint cup at the dollar store, and it's really handy, so that's what I'm using to mix everything into. And then also for hardscaping that's going to be going into the background with the foam, I have some manzanita wood branches which look really nice to make the backgrounds more dynamic. And then lastly, we have some painter's tape, which I also was able to pick up real cheap at my dollar store. So there we go, guys. That's pretty well everything you're going to need to make this awesome background. I'll provide links to most of the items you see here in the description down below. There'll be affiliate links, which means that I will make a small percentage on each sale. However, that is at no expense to you, so it's a fun way you can support the channel while getting the supplies you need to make your vivarium. Alright, so we're actually going to be making 2 backgrounds in this video, which is pretty fun. What I'm doing here is using the taller tank as a sort of station to prop up the lid against, because you have to be very careful with front opening doors. If they swing too far and don't have support, they can snap right off. The next thing we're going to do is position the wood where we want it to be in the hardscape before spraying in the foam to hold it in place. For this, I'm using a bunch of my painter's tape. I like doing that because it comes off really easily and doesn't leave any residue like duct tape probably would. I've also seen people create a chemical reaction that bonds wood to surfaces by using cotton balls and crazy glue, so that's also an alternative option you can look into and use. Again, this looks tedious, but it really wasn't that bad. I'll leave some of this time-lapse footage to show you just exactly how I went about attaching everything. Alright everyone, now that we've secured our wood where we want it to be in the final hardscape, it's time to bring out that silicone because we're going to apply a generous glob or bead to the base or point of contact on the glass to further secure it. Yes, the foam itself will hold the wood in place, but as an extra precaution, we want to actually attach the wood to the glass as well. After 24 hours of having the silicone cure, we can now begin the fun part of foaming in our background walls. Once you've put on gloves and protective eyewear, you can begin covering the first side of the terrarium. You want to make sure to place a good amount of foam around your branches so that they're nice and secure. It sort of took me a while to figure out a good technique, to be honest, but ideally you want to go in an up and down motion along the surface of the tank to get the most surface area covered. Otherwise, when you do these little swirls like I'm doing, you have to go back and patch up the spots that are missing foam, and that's a nightmare. Now, thankfully the foam cures pretty fast, so even if you were to wait 3 hours or so, you can usually safely flip the enclosure onto the next side you have to foam in, rather than having to wait a full 24 hours to complete each side of the enclosure. Now, although the foam is pretty easy to carve away once it's cured, I did want to make sure not to get too close to the top of the enclosure. Also keep in mind that the foam will expand a little bit as it cures, so definitely take that into consideration as well. Now that our foam is cured, it's time to get carving. Listen folks, there are many ways to carve. You can use knives and other things, but I'm going to tell you right now that using a Dremel tool is hands down the best way to go about doing this. Look, it's messy and you definitely want to wear a mask to protect your lungs, but if you combine the Dremel tool with a shop vacuum next to it the whole time, it'll get most of the particles that come flying off that you're carving. The reason I love using a Dremel tool so much is it gives you such a dynamic but continuous texture. You can really get in there and make everything have a sense of fluidity and motion without having these jagged, uneven cuts that are very clearly cut by a knife. You can really get in there and, as you see here, make dynamic configurations to that background. You can even carve little holes that come out the other side. Also friends, exercise caution when using a Dremel tool. If you have long hair, make sure it's tied back and kept clear from your work area. I also wanted to mention that it is possible to scratch the glass with the Dremel, so do be careful where you have that thing pointed while it's on. Once your background is carved, you're going to want to apply silicone all around each side of the foam background. When you're using Drylok, one of the observations a few friends have made is that it applies pressure or weight and can sometimes shrink the background, which can cause it to peel or separate off the wall. By applying the silicone, this type of separation doesn't really occur. So it is worth doing, friends. Don't skip out on this step. Once our silicone is cured for 24 hours, we can prepare for the dry locking process. What I'm doing here is applying some painter's tape to the wood so that I don't really have to worry about getting paint on it. Unless you cover the whole thing, you'll still get some drops on the wood, but don't worry, you can easily sand these off, and honestly, you only have to worry about the sides that'll be visible to whoever's looking at the enclosure head on. Okay, now it's time to get set up for dry locking. What we're going to do is pour some of the Drylok into our painter's cup and mix in our cement colors. Next, you want to stir your Drylok to make sure that anything that is settled is evenly mixed together and has the same consistency. That should do it. Perfect. Now you want to carefully pour the Drylok into your painter's cup, but whatever you do, don't be me and pour half the bucket out onto your table. Now let's add the liquid cement color. I'm going to slowly apply a bit of it and stir, and then evaluate the color it's at and keep adding it till I get the consistency I want. I'm also adding a little bit of the brown color here, but overall I want my base coat to be dark. That's just my own personal choice here. Okay friends, so now all we're going to do is simply take our paintbrush and begin applying a generous coat of the Drylok over every surface of the foam. We want to make sure that all the little nooks and crannies get coated as well. Once that first initial layer has dried overnight, we can apply a second and maybe even third coat if we feel it's necessary. You'll definitely want a second coat on there though. I usually like to apply coats of Drylok onto the background until I can no longer see the air bubbles from the foam. That way I know that I've put enough layers on without removing the texture I've created with the Dremel tool, while also ensuring that the background is now sealed. Now that 2 coats of Drylok have cured on my background, I'm going to take a little bit more and mix in a lot of the brown liquid cement color. And what we're going to do with this is apply it as sort of a thin dry brushing technique to add that sort of earthy tone or texture I'm going for. I want this background to look something like an eroded clay soil, if you will. There we go friends, I don't know about you, but I am very happy with that background. Especially considering that this is actually the first time I've ever made a Drylok background. Yeah, I'm really happy with the results. With my first background completed, it was time to get the second one ready and start with the dry brushing process here. Practice makes perfect. After completing my first terrarium background there, I decided for the second one to use a more gentle dry brushing technique because I wanted to leave a lot of that dark base color exposed. I think the finishing look for this is a lot nicer, and well, you see for yourself and let me know what you think. Alright guys, and that's really it. Now that we've removed all the painter's tape from the border of the background as well as the wood and sanded off any additional paint stuck to the wood, the background is finished, and that's it. It's that easy. Now that we're going to set up our vivarium, it's time to spray down all the walls of the enclosure. I like to do this to just give it a good rinse off. Now the first one's done, we'll spray down the second smaller one. And conveniently, these tanks have the drainage bulkheads, so we can just drain that water right out. Now, the first thing we're going to do is lay down a drainage layer. For this tank, I'm putting some leftover Hydroton I had into it. I've rinsed it thoroughly to remove all the dust and loose particles. And so now what we'll do is just spread it evenly across the floor surface of the enclosure. This tank is the Dart Frog terrarium model from the Frogs & Co line. It's a 18 by 18 by 18 inch enclosure. Next thing we're going to do is lay down our biodrain terrarium mesh over the drainage layer. And this is to prevent our substrate that we'll place over this from falling down through into the hydroton. If that were to occur, we wouldn't actually have the separation barrier between the drainage layer that can be full of water and our substrate. Now it's time for us to add our substrate to the vivarium. For this, I'm going to be using the Exoterra substratum. I'm really looking forward to seeing how this substrate works out. Now, I did decide against rinsing it before placing it in the enclosure out of fear that I'd be removing the beneficial nitrifying bacteria from the substrate. Fortunately, as you can see here, it isn't dusty at all. Before we begin planting the enclosure, I wanted to give the substratum a good spray down so that it'd be hydrated and support the new plant cuttings going into the enclosure. Using small pieces of toothpick, I was able to help secure plants into the background by gently poking them through the wall. It leaves a very small mark even when you remove the toothpicks. Adding leaf litter to the floor of the enclosure is another important step. Once you've done that though, you're pretty much there. I don't know about you guys, but this enclosure looks really awesome. Now it's time to do the tree frog size terrarium, which is the 18 by 18 by 24 size. For this enclosure's drainage layer, I'm going to use this large piece of filter foam I had left over. We'll lay the biomesh over it and put the substratum over that. This enclosure will be housing a pair of Dendrobates tinctorius, so I'm going to be placing a few petri dishes down with cocoa huts over them as egg-laying sites. I cut up a bit of java moss and placed it over top of each hut. As long as these stay wet through the misting cycles, the moss should spread over each cocoa hut. Alright everybody, back to planting we go. And it's really simple with the substratum. All you need to do is cover your roots in it or stick the cuttings directly into the substrate and have them root over time. Here I'm using a little bit of moss to conceal the toothpicks that are holding up this plant. Again, this might spread over time if it's in the right conditions. Now we're just going to add a few springtails to the enclosure as a sort of bioactive cleanup crew. These animals will help control the levels of mold in the enclosure and will provide the dart frogs with a bit of food as well, because they do like eating them. Now that these amphibian vivariums are completely set up, you can do one of two things. The first is that I would recommend you allow the enclosure to grow in for at least a few months. What this will do is provide the plants with ample opportunity to not only acclimate to the new environment, your moss will start to take over, the enclosure will establish itself. That's not to say that you couldn't go ahead and add your animals in right away. It's just that most people will choose to do that when it's probably more advisable that you allow the enclosure to grow in if you have the time. Now for me, I do sort of have a sense of urgency. I would really like to move a lot of my frogs out of being kept in larger bins into naturalistic vivaria, so I'm actually going to put my frogs into these tanks despite the fact that the plants haven't really grown in yet. So we'll see how that goes. Sometimes with larger animals, you can bet that you're gonna get a lot of damage and your plants probably will go into shock from being trampled by the inhabitants. However, dart frogs are pretty light, pretty small, so generally speaking, the plants I've put into the enclosure, I'm not too concerned about suffering any damage from the dart frogs being in there right away. So what we're going to do next is move 2 of my dart frog species into these enclosures. Lazuli and Cyane, my Dendrobates tinctorius azuris, the blue dying poison dart frogs. They're the only frogs you've seen. They're gonna be going into the large model here. And then I have 2 Dendrobates tinctorius cobalt. They're gonna go in this enclosure here, the smaller 18 by 18 by 18 dart frog vivarium. And I'm gonna give you guys a little hint that I actually have 3 more of these enclosures that I'm gonna be designing in the next few days, and I can't wait to show you how they turn out because they will be housing more dart frog species that I'm going to introduce to you in the coming weeks. So stay tuned for that. Alright, so I have some gloves I put on and just gently rinsed off. Friends, these are my Dendrobates tinctorius cobalt. Alright guys, we're gonna get Lazuli and Cyane, my Dendrobates tinctorius azuris, into their beautifully planted natural vivarium. For today's question of the day, I'd like to ask you all, what type of animal would you create a Drylok background for? You can make Drylok backgrounds for just about any type of environment, whether it's a desert reptile, tropical, or anything else. So let me know in the comments section what you would choose to make this type of background for. As always, I'll give your comment a heart and we'll engage in a little bit of a conversation. Well everybody, there you have it. I sincerely hope that you enjoyed learning about how to create your own Drylok background for your vivariums, as well as setting up a dart frog vivarium like you see here. If you guys have any questions at all, definitely drop them down in the comments section and I'll try to get to them as soon as possible. If you would like to support this channel further, I have my merch store linked down below, as well as my Patreon page where you can become a channel patron for as little as $2 a month to unlock all sorts of different perks that come with the patronage. Alright everyone, if you want to see more terrarium tutorial videos, check out the link up above. Otherwise friends, I can't wait to see you all on Tuesday for our next video. Have an awesome weekend. Take care.